You ever hear a jet try to wake up and fail? The question hung in the dry afternoon air, swallowed almost instantly by the low murmur of generators and the distant hum of base activity. But it was enough to draw a few smirks from the crew gathered around the silent A-10 parked on the sun-baked tarmac, its matte gray skin dull under the Texas heat, its twin engines lifeless despite hours of diagnostics that insisted nothing was wrong. And at the center of it all stood Captain Ryan Cole, arms crossed, jaw tight, staring at the aircraft like it had personally insulted him, while a cluster of technicians hovered nearby with tablets and cables, their screens glowing green with system checks that all agreed on one thing. Everything was operational, everything was fine, and yet the warthog refused to breathe, refused to turn, refused to even acknowledge their commands, as if the machine itself had decided it was done taking orders from anyone, especially them. And that was when Cole exhaled sharply, shaking his head with a short, humorless laugh before glancing over his shoulder toward the edge of the tarmac, where an old man stood just inside the boundary line, hands buried in the pockets of a worn canvas jacket that looked older than half the crew present, his posture relaxed but his eyes fixed on the aircraft with a focus that didn't match the rest of him, and Cole's gaze lingered there for a moment before he smirked. The kind of smirk that came easy when confidence had never really been challenged, and he called out, loud enough for the others to hear. "Hey, you. Sir, since you've been standing there watching us work, you want to give it a shot?" A few heads turned, some chuckles followed, subtle but sharp, because everyone understood the tone, and the old man didn't respond right away, didn't flinch or straighten or offer any sign that he'd even heard, just kept his eyes on the aircraft as if the conversation existed somewhere else entirely. And that silence seemed to amuse Cole even more as he took a few steps closer, boots crunching against the gravel, his voice lighter now, almost playful. "What is it? You used to turn wrenches back in the day? Think you can start her up where a full team of certified specialists can't?" The technicians exchanged glances, one of them letting out a quiet snort, because the idea itself was ridiculous. This relic of a man standing in front of a machine built decades after his prime, a machine governed by systems and software and precision beyond anything back in the day could have prepared him for. And yet the old man finally shifted, just slightly, his gaze lifting from the aircraft to meet Cole's. And there was something in that look, not defiance, not irritation, but a calm, steady awareness that seemed to slow the moment down, like the air itself had thickened, and for a brief second Cole felt it, that strange flicker of hesitation he couldn't quite explain, before he brushed it off with a shrug and gestured toward the A-10. "Go ahead, humor me," he said, stepping aside with a casual wave. "Let's see what you've got." And the crew leaned in just a little, curiosity mixing with amusement, because everyone loves a harmless spectacle, especially one that confirms what they already believe. And the old man finally moved, slow and deliberate, each step measured as he approached the aircraft, his boots making almost no sound against the hot concrete, his attention never leaving the warthog's silent frame, not the cockpit, not the panels, but something else entirely, something the others weren't even looking at. And the laughter faded, not all at once, but enough to leave a thin layer of quiet in its place, the kind of quiet that settles in when something subtle begins to shift, and no one can quite explain why. And somewhere behind them, a young airman named Lucas Reed felt it too. That quiet, that tension, like the moment before a storm that no forecast had predicted. And he glanced from the old man to the aircraft and back again, a faint unease tightening in his chest. Because for the first time since this whole mess had started, it didn't feel like they were watching a joke anymore. It felt like they were about to witness something they didn't understand. The old man did not reach for the cockpit, did not ask for clearance, did not even acknowledge the cluster of technicians stepping back to give him room. Instead, he slowed as he came alongside the aircraft's left engine, his gaze narrowing slightly, as if he were listening rather than looking. And that alone drew a few confused glances because there was nothing to hear except the faint ticking of cooling metal and the distant whine of ground equipment. Yet he stood there as if the machine was speaking to him in a language no one else understood. And Captain Cole folded his arms tighter, the earlier amusement still present, but now edged with impatience, watching as the old man circled a few more steps, not touching anything yet, just observing, tracing lines along the fuselage with his eyes, following seams and rivets that every technician there had already inspected twice. And still he said nothing, which seemed to irritate Cole more than any argument would have, because silence offered nothing to push against, nothing to dismiss. Just an absence that forced attention where it was not wanted, and one of the specialists cleared his throat, tapping his tablet lightly as if to reassert control over the situation. "We have already run full diagnostics," he said, voice firm but careful. "Fuel flow is within normal range. Ignition sequence is responsive. There are no fault codes." And Cole nodded once, almost reflexively, repeating it louder as if to make sure the message landed. "Everything checks out," he said, his tone sharpening slightly, "which means there is nothing to fix." And for a moment it felt like the situation would snap back into place, logic reestablishing itself. But the old man finally moved his hand, not toward any obvious control panel or access port, but to a small section just beneath the intake, a place so unremarkable that it had been ignored entirely, and his fingers hovered there for a second before lightly brushing the surface, as if confirming something he had already decided. And that was when Lucas Reed felt it again, that subtle shift, the same quiet pressure in his chest that had no clear source, because the old man was not guessing, he was not experimenting, he was recognizing, and that difference settled into the air like a weight, and Cole noticed it too, though he would not have admitted it, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer. "You see something?" he asked, the question casual on the surface but edged with something else underneath, something closer to challenge than curiosity, and the old man did not look at him when he answered, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to be heard without effort. "Panel is off by a fraction," he said, and one of the technicians let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "It is within tolerance," he replied, quickly, almost defensively. "We checked torque specifications twice," and the old man nodded once, not disagreeing, not arguing, just acknowledging. "It is within your tolerance," he said, and that phrasing hung there for a moment, subtle but deliberate, and Cole exhaled sharply, a hint of irritation breaking through now. "Look," he said, gesturing toward the aircraft with an open hand. "We have sensors, we have data, we have people trained specifically for this system, so unless you can point to something real, something measurable," he paused, letting the implication settle. "This is not helping." And for the first time the old man shifted his attention fully, not to Cole, but to the aircraft again, his fingers pressing lightly against the panel before pulling back, and his eyes drifted upward, following the curve of the intake, the angle of the wing, the way the heat shimmered faintly along the metal surface. And he took a slow breath, as if aligning himself with something unseen. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, almost to himself. "She is not getting what she needs," he said, and the choice of words drew another round of restrained smiles from the crew, because machines did not need. They responded, they executed, they followed input, and yet the old man stepped back half a pace, giving the aircraft space as if it mattered. And that was when Lucas made his decision, subtle and quick, pulling his phone from his pocket and turning slightly away from the group, his thumb moving across the screen with practiced precision. Because something about this was wrong, not broken, not malfunctioning, but misjudged, and he could not explain it, but he had seen enough to know. When something did not fit, and behind him, Captain Cole watched the old man with a narrowing gaze, the humor now almost completely gone, replaced by a quiet tension that he could not quite name, because the longer this went on, the less it felt like a joke, and the more it felt like he had invited something onto his flight line that he did not fully understand. Lucas Reed stepped farther away from the group, just enough to keep his voice low as his call connected, his eyes still fixed on the old man who now crouched slightly beside the engine housing, not rushing, not second-guessing, but moving with a kind of certainty that felt out of place on a modern flight line filled with procedure and protocol. And when the line clicked alive, Lucas spoke quickly but carefully, choosing each word like it mattered. "Sir, this is Airman First Class Lucas Reed. From Maintenance Sector Charlie, I think you need to hear this." And there was a pause on the other end, brief but sharp, the kind of silence that belonged to someone who did not tolerate wasted time. "Go ahead," the voice replied, calm but alert, and Lucas swallowed once, glancing back toward Captain Cole, who was now watching the old man with open scrutiny, no longer amused. "We have a civilian out here," Lucas continued. "Older male, no credentials on record, but he is looking at the A-10, like he knows it, and he just called out a panel discrepancy that our diagnostics missed." Another pause, longer this time, and Lucas could almost hear the mental shift happening on the other end. "Name," the voice asked, and Lucas hesitated, realizing he had not heard it directly. Only the echo of Cole's sarcasm earlier. But something surfaced in his memory, something about the way the old man carried himself, the quiet weight of it. And he spoke anyway. "I did not catch it officially, sir, but I heard someone say Donovan." And that was when the silence on the line changed completely. Not empty anymore, but charged, like a switch had been flipped somewhere far above Lucas's level. And when the voice returned, it was no longer just attentive. It was focused. "Stay where you are," it said, each word measured. "Do not interfere, do not remove him, and do not let anyone shut that aircraft down if it comes alive." And Lucas blinked slightly at that last part, his grip tightening on the phone. "Yes, sir," he replied automatically, even though the instruction did not fully make sense yet, and the line went dead without another word, leaving him standing there with a growing awareness that something much larger had just been set in motion, and back by the aircraft. Captain Cole had stepped closer, now only a few feet from the old man, watching as he reached into his jacket and pulled out nothing more than a small, worn cloth, the kind mechanics used to wipe grease from their hands, and Cole's brow furrowed slightly, confusion mixing with irritation. "You planning to clean it into working condition?" he asked, his tone sharper now, the edge of authority pushing through, but the old man did not respond directly. Instead, he ran the cloth lightly along the edge of the panel he had pointed out earlier, not scrubbing, not fixing, just clearing away a thin layer of dust that revealed a subtle misalignment. So slight it could have been dismissed as nothing, but under the sunlight it caught just enough to show a difference. And one of the technicians leaned in, squinting, his earlier confidence faltering for a fraction of a second, because he had not seen that. None of them had, and the old man straightened slowly, his hand resting briefly against the metal as if acknowledging it. And for just a moment the world around him seemed to dissolve, not visibly, not in a way anyone else could see, but inside his eyes something shifted, the reflection of the aircraft replaced by something older, something louder, the clean tarmac giving way in memory to a strip of rough ground under a sky that did not stay quiet for long. The same shape of wings, the same stubborn engine that refused to cooperate until you understood what it needed. And then it was gone, the present snapping back into place as he stepped toward a small access latch just beneath the panel, his movements deliberate, practiced without being rushed, and Captain Cole felt it then, not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable sensation of control. Slipping, of a situation he had initiated no longer belonging entirely to him. And he opened his mouth to say something, to reassert authority, to pull the moment back into familiar territory, but no words came out, because deep down, beneath the training and the rank and the confidence, something quieter had already started to take hold, a realization forming without permission, that this was no longer about proving a point, and that whatever happened next was not going to follow the script he had expected. The latch clicked open with a soft metallic note that seemed far too quiet for the amount of attention it drew, and every set of eyes on the tarmac followed the old man's hand as he eased the panel outward, not forcing it, not prying, just guiding it like he had done it 1,000 times before, and the inside revealed nothing dramatic, no broken parts, no obvious failure, just a narrow assembly of components that had already been inspected, documented, and cleared by the team standing there. Yet something in the way he looked at it made the space feel different, like it held a detail that had been overlooked not because it was hidden, but because no one had known how to see it, and Captain Cole stepped closer again, his boots stopping just short of the open panel, his voice lower now, more controlled. "Whatever you think you are doing, you need to explain it," he said, the authority still present, but no longer absolute. And the old man reached in slowly, his fingers moving past the obvious connectors and wiring, bypassing the parts designed to be serviced quickly, until they found a small linkage tucked deeper inside, something that did not look wrong at first glance, but under his touch it shifted slightly, just enough to confirm what he already knew, and he paused there, holding it between two fingers, his gaze steady, and for a brief moment the present thinned again, replaced by a memory that carried weight without noise. The hum of an aircraft waiting on a strip of rough ground, the pressure of time without panic, the understanding that sometimes machines did not fail loudly, they failed quietly, through small misalignments that compounded until nothing worked the way it should. And back on the tarmac his hand moved with that same understanding, applying just enough pressure to realign the linkage, not forcing it into place, but guiding it until it settled with a faint, almost imperceptible shift, and he held it there for a second longer, as if confirming the correction, before letting go, and one of the technicians leaned in again, his earlier certainty gone now, replaced by a focused uncertainty. "That component passed inspection," he said. But his voice lacked the firmness it had before, and the old man gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without challenging it. "It would," he replied quietly, "unless you knew where to look." And that answer did not land as an argument. It landed as fact, simple and unadorned, and Captain Cole felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable pressure of a situation slipping beyond his control, because this was no longer about a joke. No longer about proving a point. This was something else entirely, something that did not fit into the systems he trusted. And behind him Lucas Reed returned, slipping the phone back into his pocket, his eyes moving quickly between the old man and the aircraft, carrying a tension that had not been there before, a quiet urgency that he did not voice, because he knew better than to interrupt what was happening now. And the old man closed the panel gently, securing it with a motion that was precise without being rushed, as if he respected the machine enough not to treat it like a problem to be solved, but something to be understood. And then he stepped back, just one pace, giving the aircraft space again, his eyes lifting toward the cockpit for the first time since he had approached, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. No laughter, no side comments, just the low hum of distant equipment and the sound of wind brushing lightly across the open tarmac. And Captain Cole cleared his throat, the motion subtle but deliberate, as if preparing to reclaim the moment, to restore the order that had been disrupted. "All right," he said, his voice steady but carrying a trace of something new beneath it. "If you are done, we will take it from here." And the old man looked at him then, not confrontational, not challenging, just calm. And for a second Cole felt that same hesitation again, sharper this time, because the look carried no need to prove anything, no demand for recognition, just a quiet certainty that made everything else feel less solid. And the old man turned slightly, his gaze returning to the aircraft, and spoke in that same low, even tone. "Go ahead," he said, "she is ready." And the words settled into the air with a weight that no one could quite explain. Because nothing visible had changed, no alarms had cleared, no systems had reset, and yet the certainty in his voice made it feel like something had already shifted, something unseen but real. And Captain Cole stood there for a fraction of a second longer than he intended, caught between instinct and procedure, between skepticism and the growing realization that the moment no longer belonged entirely to him. And when he finally turned toward the cockpit controls, it was not with the same confidence he had before, but with a measured caution, as if he were about to test something he could not fully explain. And behind him the entire crew watched in silence, waiting for the machine to answer. Captain Cole climbed the short ladder into the cockpit with a motion that felt more deliberate than before, his usual confidence tempered by something quieter, something that had settled in after the old man's final words. And as he lowered himself into the seat, the familiar layout of controls and switches greeted him like an old script he had followed countless times. Yet now there was a subtle hesitation in his movements, a fraction of a second where instinct paused before action, and outside the aircraft the crew stood in a loose semicircle, no longer speaking, no longer exchanging knowing looks, just watching, their earlier certainty replaced by a focused stillness that mirrored the tension in the air. And Lucas Reed found himself holding his breath without realizing it, his eyes fixed on the cockpit canopy, as if the answer to everything would appear there first, while the old man stood several feet back, hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable, as if the outcome had already been decided and he had no need to witness it. And inside the cockpit Cole began the startup sequence, his hands moving across the switches with practiced precision, battery on, fuel systems engaged, ignition armed, each step executed exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been done earlier when nothing happened. And for a brief moment the familiar rhythm returned, the comfort of procedure reasserting itself. But beneath it there was something else now, a quiet awareness that this attempt was different, not because the system had changed, but because something unseen had shifted beneath it. And when his hand reached the final control, he hesitated again, just for a second, before pushing it forward. And the response came not immediately, but subtly, a low vibration that traveled through the frame of the aircraft, faint at first, almost uncertain, like a breath drawn. After a long silence, and outside the crew leaned in instinctively, their eyes narrowing as they listened, because they had heard this before, the beginning of a start that never completed, the same false promise that had ended in frustration, and Captain Cole felt it too, that familiar doubt rising, his jaw tightening as he watched the gauges, waiting for them to stall, to confirm what he expected, but the vibration did not fade this time. It deepened, growing steadier, stronger, as if something inside the aircraft had finally aligned with the command it was receiving, and the first engine began to turn, slowly at first, the rotation hesitant but real, and a murmur rippled through the crew, not loud, not excited, just a collective shift in breath, because this was already more than they had achieved before. And Cole leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the readings, watching as the numbers climbed where they had previously stalled, and for the first time since this began, uncertainty gave way to something else, something closer to disbelief. And then the sound came, low and rising, the unmistakable whine of an engine finding its rhythm, building from a fragile start into a steady, growing presence that filled the air around the aircraft. And the second engine followed, not delayed, not struggling, but responding in sync, as if it had been waiting for the first to prove it was possible. And the combined sound rolled across the tarmac, no longer hesitant, no longer incomplete, but whole, alive, undeniable. And the crew stood frozen, their earlier confidence replaced by a silence that carried weight, because there was no explanation they could reach for, no data point they could cite, only the reality unfolding in front of them. And Lucas Reed felt a chill move through him despite the heat, his eyes shifting instinctively toward the old man, who had not moved, had not reacted, had not even turned to look at the engines now roaring behind him, as if this outcome had never been in question. And inside the cockpit Captain Cole sat perfectly still for a moment, his hand resting on the controls, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he believed he understood, because this was not supposed to happen, not like this, not after everything had already been declared operational and still failed. And yet here it was, undeniable and complete. And as the sound of the engines settled into a steady, powerful rhythm, filling the space with a presence that demanded acknowledgement, Cole slowly lifted his gaze, looking out through the canopy toward the old man standing on the tarmac. And for the first time since he had spoken to him, there was no trace of amusement left in his expression, only a quiet, dawning realization that the moment he thought he controlled had never truly belonged to him at all. The engines did not just run, they settled into a rhythm that felt deliberate, controlled, as if the aircraft itself had finally decided to cooperate. And that sound carried across the tarmac with a presence that silenced everything else, conversations, assumptions, even the quiet confidence that had defined the crew just minutes before. And one by one, the technicians lowered their tablets, their eyes no longer searching for data points or error codes, but fixed on the machine they had already declared functional yet lifeless, now proving them wrong in the most undeniable way possible. And Captain Cole remained in the cockpit, his hand still resting near the controls, not moving, not adjusting, just absorbing, because there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to justify. The aircraft was running exactly as it should have been from the beginning, and that realization pressed in on him, heavier with each passing second, not as failure, but as something more complex, something that did not fit neatly into procedure or rank. And outside, Lucas Reed exhaled slowly, only now realizing how long he had been holding his breath, his eyes shifting again toward the old man, who had already begun to step away, not hurried, not seeking attention, just turning from the aircraft, as if his part in the moment had ended the second the engines came alive. And that quiet departure felt almost out of place against the weight of what had just happened, because no one stopped him, no one called out, not even Captain Cole, who now watched from the cockpit as the figure moved farther across the tarmac, growing smaller against the wide expanse of concrete and sky. And something in that image stayed with him, something unresolved, as if the moment had not truly concluded, only shifted. And then a voice broke through the steady engine noise, sharp and clear over the radio clipped to one of the crew chiefs. "This is command. Confirm status of aircraft in maintenance sector Charlie." The words cut through the air with authority, drawing immediate attention, and the crew chief responded quickly, his tone more formal than before. "Aircraft is operational. Engines are running. No faults detected." There was a brief pause, just long enough to suggest the information had been expected. "Maintain current status," the voice replied. "Do not shut down until further instruction." And that directive added another layer to the moment, because now it was no longer contained within the tarmac. It had reached higher, into a chain of awareness that carried weight beyond the crew standing there. And Lucas felt it again, that sense of something larger unfolding, his earlier call echoing in his mind, and he glanced toward the edge of the tarmac where the old man had been, only to find the space empty now, the figure already gone from immediate sight. And that absence felt just as significant as his presence had moments ago, as if the explanation had walked away before anyone could ask for it. And Captain Cole finally moved, his hand leaving the controls as he rose slightly in the seat, his gaze scanning the area outside, searching for the man he had addressed so casually not long ago. But there was nothing to find, only the crew, the aircraft, and the steady sound of engines that had no business running except for one quiet correction no one else had seen. And he climbed down from the cockpit more slowly than he had entered, his boots hitting the ground with a weight that matched the shift in his understanding. And when he turned to face the crew, there was no immediate command, no attempt to reassert the tone from earlier. Just a brief moment where he stood there, taking in the same scene they were, the same reality they all now shared. And it was Lucas who finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "Sir?" That was him. And Cole looked at him, not sharply, not dismissively, but with a focus that had replaced his earlier certainty. "Who?" he asked, and Lucas hesitated only for a second before answering. "Donovan." And the name settled between them, unfamiliar to some, but carrying a weight that none of them could quite define yet. And somewhere beyond the tarmac, unseen but already in motion, the consequences of that name were beginning to move closer. The name did not echo loudly, but it did not need to, because something in the way it was spoken carried weight, and Captain Cole felt it before he understood it, a subtle shift in the air that had nothing to do with the engines still running behind him. And he looked past Lucas, scanning the far edge of the tarmac where the old man had disappeared, but there was nothing there now except heat shimmer and empty concrete stretching toward the hangars. And that absence pressed harder than any explanation could have, because it meant the moment had already moved on without waiting for him to catch up. And then the sound of approaching tires cut through the steady hum of the aircraft, low at first, then sharper as a dark government vehicle rolled into view from the service road, moving faster than routine traffic ever did on base, its path direct, its intent unmistakable. And the crew turned almost in unison, their attention pulled away from the aircraft for the first time since it came alive. Because this kind of arrival did not happen without reason, and the vehicle came to a controlled stop just short of the group, the engine idling for only a second before the door opened, and the man who stepped out carried a presence that did not need introduction, his uniform crisp, his posture exact, his gaze already scanning the scene with a precision that missed nothing. And the moment he took in the running engines, the open space where the old man had stood, and the cluster of personnel now watching him, his expression shifted slightly. Not surprise, not confusion, but confirmation. And Captain Cole straightened instinctively, the reflex of rank taking over as he stepped forward, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a formal composure. "Sir," he began, but the officer raised a hand just enough to pause him, not dismissive, not harsh, just controlled. "Where is he?" The question came direct, without preamble, and Cole hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. But it was enough to reveal that he did not have the answer. And it was Lucas who spoke again, his voice steady despite the tension building around him. "He was here, sir. Just a minute ago, he walked off that direction," he said, gesturing toward the far side of the tarmac, and the officer followed the line of his hand, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if calculating distance, time, possibility, and for a moment no one spoke, the only sound the steady, unwavering rhythm of the aircraft behind them. And then the officer exhaled slowly, a measured release that carried more meaning than frustration. "Of course he did," he said, quietly, almost to himself, before turning his attention back to the crew, his gaze settling briefly on Captain Cole, not with judgment, but with a weight that suggested understanding beyond the immediate moment. "You let him walk." It was not an accusation, not exactly, but it landed that way anyway, and Cole felt it, the realization settling deeper now, because he had not just underestimated a man, he had failed to recognize something far more significant, something that did not announce itself with rank or credentials. And before he could respond, the officer continued, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more formal, more deliberate. "That aircraft," he said, nodding toward the A-10, "has been grounded for 2 days despite full system clearance." He paused, letting that fact settle. "And it comes back online the moment he touches it." Another pause, shorter this time. "That is not coincidence." And the crew stood in silence, no one attempting to explain, no one reaching for technical language, because none of it fit anymore, and Lucas felt a quiet tension build in his chest again, not uncertainty this time, but anticipation, because whatever came next was not going to return things to normal. It was going to redefine what normal had been in the first place. And the officer finally took a step forward, his eyes sweeping the group once more before settling into a calm, steady focus. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice lower now, carrying a weight that pulled everyone in. "Men like that do not show up by accident." And the words hung there, simple but heavy, as the sound of the engines continued to fill the air, steady and alive, a constant reminder that something had already changed, and that the full meaning of it was only just beginning to surface. The officer did not raise his voice, did not need to, because the weight of what he said settled deeper than any command could have, and the crew stood still under that quiet pressure, the steady roar of the aircraft now sounding less like background noise and more like a reminder of something they had all just witnessed without fully understanding. And Captain Cole felt it more than the others, the shift in his own position, not in rank, not in authority, but in certainty, because everything he had relied on had just been bypassed by a man who did not announce himself, did not argue, did not even stay to explain. And the officer took another step forward, his eyes moving across the aircraft with a familiarity that suggested he already knew more than he was saying, before returning to Cole. "You asked him to prove something, did you not?" he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and Cole did not answer immediately, because there was no version of that moment that sounded acceptable now. No way to frame it that did not reveal exactly what had happened, and the silence stretched just long enough for the truth to settle on its own, and the officer gave a slight nod, as if confirming what he already understood. "He does not prove things," he continued, his tone calm but precise. "He solves them." And that distinction landed heavily, not just on Cole, but on everyone listening, because it reframed the entire event, not as a demonstration, not as luck, but as something deliberate, something rooted in a level of understanding they had not even considered, and Lucas Reed felt that realization click into place with a clarity that made his earlier unease make sense, because the old man had never been reacting. He had been reading the situation from the moment he arrived, seeing what the rest of them could not, and choosing when to act, and more importantly, when to leave. And the officer turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the far edge of the tarmac again, where the heat shimmer distorted the horizon just enough to make it impossible to see clearly, and for a moment it felt like he was looking beyond it, beyond the base, beyond the present, into something older, something that carried history with it. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but it carried even more weight. "Earl Donovan," he said, the name now fully formed, no longer a guess or a fragment, was never assigned to maintenance. He paused, letting that fact settle. He was the one they called when maintenance failed. and a subtle shift moved through the group, not visible in any dramatic way, but felt, because that single statement reframed everything they thought they understood about the man, about his presence, about the way he moved and spoke and saw things others missed. And Captain Cole felt something tighten in his chest again, not defensiveness this time, not resistance, but recognition, because the memory of that calm gaze, that quiet certainty, no longer felt like something to dismiss. It felt like something he should have recognized from the beginning. And the officer continued, his attention returning to the aircraft as if it were part of the explanation. There are people who follow procedures, he said, and there are people who understand why those procedures exist. He glanced back at Cole, not harshly, but with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. He is the second kind. And the words did not accuse, they did not diminish, but they did draw a line, one that separated knowledge from experience, authority from mastery. And for a moment no one spoke, because there was nothing to add, nothing to argue, only the steady, unwavering sound of the engines behind them, still running, still alive, a constant reminder that something fundamental had shifted. And then the officer reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device, his movements controlled and efficient, and he spoke into it briefly, his words low and precise, issuing instructions that did not need to be heard by the group to be understood as significant. And when he finished, he lowered the device and looked at Cole once more. "You will keep that aircraft running until further notice," he said. "And you will remember this moment." A slight pause, just enough to emphasize what came next, not because of the machine, his gaze sharpened slightly, but because of the man you almost dismissed. And the statement settled heavily, not as a reprimand, but as something more lasting, something that would remain long after the engines powered down, long after the tarmac returned to routine. And as the officer turned away, stepping back toward the waiting vehicle, the crew remained where they were, still, quiet, each of them carrying a different version of the same realization, that what they had just witnessed was not just a fix, not just a correction, but a glimpse into a level of mastery that did not need recognition to exist, and somewhere beyond the edge of the base, unseen and already gone. The man who had made it possible continued on without looking back. The engines continued to run long after the vehicle disappeared down the service road, their steady rhythm filling the space with a presence that no one seemed willing to interrupt. And for the first time since the moment had begun, there was no urgency left, no confusion, only a quiet weight that settled over the tarmac like heat rising from the concrete. And Captain Cole stood where he was, his gaze fixed not on the aircraft, but on the empty stretch where the old man had walked away, as if expecting something more to happen, some final explanation, some confirmation that would make sense of what he had just witnessed. But nothing came. Only the distant shimmer of air and the fading imprint of a moment that had already passed. And behind him the crew slowly returned to motion, not with the usual chatter or routine efficiency, but with a subdued awareness, each movement more deliberate, more thoughtful, as if something in their understanding had shifted in a way they could not fully articulate. And Lucas Reed remained still for a second longer than the others, his eyes tracing the same path the old man had taken, committing it to memory without knowing why, because it felt important, not as a detail, but as a reminder. And when he finally turned back toward the aircraft, the sound of the engines no longer felt like a problem solved. It felt like a statement, something that existed beyond procedure, beyond checklists, something that demanded respect without ever asking for it. And Captain Cole exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding since before the engines came alive. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not diminished, but changed, carrying a tone that had not been there earlier. "Log everything," he said, the words simple, but the intent behind them different, because this was no longer just about documentation. It was about remembering, about making sure that this moment did not fade into routine, did not get filed away as an anomaly to be ignored. And the crew nodded, not out of habit, but with a shared understanding that this mattered. And as they moved to their stations, recording data, confirming readings, maintaining the steady operation of the aircraft, the rhythm of the base began to return, slowly, cautiously, like something adjusting to a new balance. And yet beneath it all, the awareness remained, quiet but persistent, and Captain Cole took one last look toward the edge of the tarmac before turning back to the aircraft, his posture straighter now, not from authority, but from something closer to respect, and he climbed the ladder again, not to test, not to prove, but to ensure, his movements measured, his attention sharper, as if he understood now that the machine in front of him was not just a system to be operated, but something that required a different kind of awareness. And as he settled into the cockpit once more, the instruments steady, the engine strong, he allowed himself a brief moment to reflect, not on the failure that had come before, but on the correction that had followed, on the quiet presence of a man who had walked in, seen what others missed, and left without waiting for recognition. And that thought stayed with him, not as a lesson spoken aloud, but as something deeper, something that would shape the way he saw things from that point forward. And out on the tarmac, Lucas Reed looked up at the aircraft one more time, the sound of it steady and unwavering, and he felt a faint sense of clarity settle in, because some things did not need to be explained to be understood, they only needed to be witnessed. And as the day moved on and the routine of the base slowly reclaimed the space, the moment did not fade. It remained, quiet and lasting, carried in the memory of everyone who had been there, a reminder that respect is not demanded, it is revealed, and once seen, it does not disappear.